April 30, 1945. Berlin is living through its final hours. Soviet artillery is already firing just a few blocks from Hitler's bunker. The Third Reich is doomed, the countdown is measured in hours. Only days earlier, the legendary test pilot Hanna Reich had managed to land a small aircraft in the middle of the battle and begged the Führer to escape. He refused. Within hours, Adolf Hitler took his own life in the bunker. But decades later, Reich told an American journalist something that would fuel conspiracy theories for years. She claimed that as she was taking off from Berlin, she saw another pilot standing beside a transport aircraft, clearly waiting for someone. Was there an escape plan that Hitler never used? And if he had fled, how long could he have survived? To understand why Hitler chose death, you need to see what was happening in those final weeks. By mid-April 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable. From the east, Soviet forces were advancing rapidly. From the west, the Americans and the British were closing in. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler had withdrawn into the Führerbunker, a reinforced concrete shelter beneath the Reich Chancellery. With him remained only his closest aides, Eva Braun, and a shrinking circle of fanatically loyal followers. Above ground, the city was being destroyed street by street. Soviet artillery relentlessly pounded the ruins. The final battle for Berlin had begun. And yet, Hitler still had options. Several escape routes were discussed by his staff. Even in those last days, ways out of Berlin still existed. The Alpine Redoubt in Bavaria, a supposed final fortress where SS propaganda claimed loyal units were preparing their last stand. Switzerland, neutral, and just across the border. Or even Argentina, via the same escape networks that would later save thousands of other Nazis. On April 26, 1945, test pilot Hanna Reich and General Robert Ritter von Greim accomplished what many considered impossible. They flew into Berlin in a small Fiesler Storch observation plane and landed in the Tiergarten, near the Brandenburg Gate, while the city was under heavy artillery bombardment. During the approach, von Greim was hit by a bullet in the leg. Reich took control and completed the landing. In the bunker, she met with Hitler. She begged him to fly out with her. According to her later testimony, Hitler handed her 2 cyanide capsules, one for herself and one for von Greim, and told her to use them if capture seemed inevitable. Once again, he refused to leave. On the night of April 28, Reich and von Greim flew out of Berlin in an Arado training aircraft. Soviet soldiers saw the takeoff. Many assumed it was Hitler escaping. Searchlights tracked the plane, and anti-aircraft fire struck it with shrapnel, but it did not go down. 2 days later, on the afternoon of April 30, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. Their bodies were burned in the garden above the bunker. But what if he had gone with Reich? What if Hitler had escaped from Berlin in those final days? What if the greatest lie of the Third Reich didn't save Hitler, but doomed him faster? And what if the one neutral country everyone assumes could have hidden him, was the last place he could survive? The SS had quietly cracked Alan Dullah's cipher system and were intercepting Allied intelligence cables in real time. They knew something crucial: the Allies already feared a last Nazi fortress in the Alps. So Goebbels' propaganda machine did something brilliant and dangerous: it didn't invent a new lie. It simply amplified the lie the Allies were already telling themselves. Fake reports were reinforced. Fabricated blueprints circulated. Rumors of underground bunkers, stockpiles, and elite SS divisions multiplied. Allied intelligence didn't just fall for the myth, they unknowingly helped write it. What followed was an echo chamber, where German deception and Allied assumptions fed each other. Today, historians consider the Alpine Redoubt one of the most successful intelligence deceptions of the entire war. Its fatal flaw: it came too late to matter. After the war, General Omar Bradley admitted bluntly, "I am astonished that we could have believed it as innocently as we did." German commanders were even more direct. There was no fortress. No defenses. No final army. Even if Hitler had believed his own propaganda and fled south, he would have been running toward a fantasy. On April 24, 1945, Hitler did authorize an evacuation order allowing government officials to move toward Bavaria and Austria. But he made one thing absolutely clear. He would not leave Berlin. And here's why the Alpine option would have collapsed almost immediately. First, nothing was prepared. The fortifications were fictional. The supply depots didn't exist. The thousands of fanatical defenders existed only on paper. Second, the terrain itself was a trap. Mountains can defend, but they also isolate. The Allies would have sealed the region completely. No fuel. No food. No reinforcements. By late April, Germany barely had an air force left. The Allies controlled the skies without challenge. Third, time. Even in the most optimistic scenario, even if SS units slowed the Allies and inflicted losses, the end was inevitable. Soviets from the north. Americans from the south. British and French sealing the west. The redoubt might have lasted weeks. Not months. And every extra day meant more deaths. Not only soldiers. Civilians trapped in combat zones. Prisoners still dying in concentration camps. The Holocaust was still ongoing in April 1945. Hitler's suicide in Berlin on April 30 ended the war in Europe 8 days later. Germany surrendered on May 8. Had he fled and prolonged the fighting, thousands more would have died for nothing. Sometimes, even the villain's death shortens suffering. The Alps were propaganda. But what about somewhere truly safe? Somewhere neutral? Switzerland. On paper, it looks perfect. Neutral. Close. Untouched by invasion. Routes from Bavaria to the Swiss border were still open in late April. With loyal guards and precise timing, Hitler could have crossed. But Switzerland did not want him. Granting Hitler asylum would have destroyed Switzerland's international position overnight. The country survived the war by walking a narrow and morally compromised line, trading with Germany while quietly cooperating with the Allies. That neutrality had a dark side. Switzerland sheltered some refugees, but turned away thousands of Jews, famously declaring, "The boat is full." In 1938, Swiss authorities even requested that Germany mark Jewish passports with a J to make refusal easier. Throughout the war, Swiss banks laundered vast amounts of gold stolen from Jewish victims. If Switzerland had hidden Hitler, that fragile balance would have collapsed instantly. The Allies, especially Stalin, would have demanded immediate extradition. Refusal would mean total isolation, no rail traffic, no air traffic, no trade. Switzerland would be cut off from the world. And the Swiss knew the Allies would not negotiate. Stalin wanted Hitler alive. The Americans and British needed him for Nuremberg to legitimize the post-war order. So what would Switzerland have done? They would have detained him immediately. Not as a guest, but as a prisoner. Held in a secure mountain facility while negotiations began. The outcome was inevitable. Switzerland would trade Hitler for guarantees of sovereignty and neutrality. The Allies would agree. Within weeks, Hitler would be handed over. This wouldn't have been moral courage. Swiss wartime behavior proves that. It would have been cold pragmatism. But here's the real reason Switzerland was never an option. Hitler himself. His worldview could not survive it. Imprisonment by a neutral state. Reduced to a bargaining chip. Awaiting trial before the world. His racial ideology. His belief in destiny. His identity as Führer. All of it would have ended in humiliation. If Hitler had reached Switzerland, he would have committed suicide there as well. The location might change. The ending would not. Switzerland was impossible. The Alps were a lie. And yet, thousands of Nazis did escape, using secret ratlines run by sympathetic clergy, vanishing into South America. Adolf Eichmann lived freely in Argentina for nearly 10 years. So the question naturally follows, could Hitler have disappeared the same way? The escape networks were real, and vast. They became known as the ratlines, secret routes that moved Nazi officials out of Europe after the war. These networks were built by a loose alliance of sympathetic Catholic clergy, former Nazi supporters, and intelligence operatives who shared a deep fear of communism. One of the most influential figures in this system was Bishop Alois Hitler, an Austrian cleric based in Rome and rector of the Pontifical Teutonic College. Hitler was openly sympathetic to National Socialism and fiercely anti-communist. Years earlier, he had even praised Hitler in his book The Foundations of National Socialism. The mechanics were simple, and devastatingly effective. A fugitive would first receive false identity papers through Hitler or his associates. Next came a Red Cross humanitarian passport, which required minimal verification in the confusion of post-war Europe. With those documents in hand, the escapee could board a ship, usually departing from Genoa, bound for South America. The scale of the operation was enormous. Historians estimate that 5,000 to 9,000 Nazis escaped through these routes. Roughly 5,000 ended up in Argentina alone, including at least 180 convicted war criminals. This was no secret. American intelligence knew about it. A 1947 intelligence report explicitly stated that Vatican-linked circles were funding the escape of Yugoslav Ustasha war criminals. The ratlines operated in plain sight, because powerful people chose not to shut them down. And Argentina welcomed them. When Juan Perón became president in 1946, he actively encouraged German immigration. Officially, it was about rebuilding the nation with skilled European workers. In reality, ideology played a major role. Perón had served as a military attaché in Mussolini's Italy. His immigration minister had written openly anti-Semitic works. In 1940, Argentina had closed its borders to Jewish refugees. When prominent Nazis arrived, they were often greeted, not hidden. Adolf Eichmann is the clearest example of how these escapes worked. In 1948, with help from Hitler's network, Eichmann secured permission to enter Argentina. He assumed the false identity Ricardo Clement. In 1950, he obtained a Red Cross passport and sailed from Genoa. On July 14, 1950, he arrived in Buenos Aires. For a full decade, Eichmann lived openly. He worked at a Mercedes-Benz factory. He lived with his family on Garibaldi Street in San Fernando. His wife Vera and their children joined him in 1952, fully aware of who he really was. In the late 1950s, Eichmann even recorded hours of interviews with former SS man Wilhelm Sassen, intending to publish a book. On tape, Eichmann expressed pride in his role in the Holocaust. He spoke with open anti-Semitism and satisfaction. Those recordings destroyed his later claim that he was merely a bureaucrat, following orders. The ideology never left him. Israeli Mossad agents captured Eichmann on May 11, 1960. He was tried in Jerusalem, convicted, and executed in 1962. Joseph Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor, also escaped, first to Argentina, then Paraguay, and finally Brazil. He died of a stroke while swimming in 1979. He was never brought to justice. Eichmann lived freely for a decade. Mengele died a free man. Thousands of others vanished forever. So why not Hitler? There is one decisive factor that every successful escapee shared, and Hitler did not. To understand it, compare Hitler to those who vanished. Eichmann was a mid-level bureaucrat. If you passed him on a street in Buenos Aires, he was just another man. Mengele was infamous to survivors, but to the wider world, he was unknown. Hitler was different. For 12 years, his face had filled every newspaper, every poster, every newsreel on earth. He was the most recognizable man alive. There was no anonymity for him. No blending in. No second life. Then there was health. When Eichmann fled in 1950, he was 39 years old, physically fit. Mengele was 34 when he escaped, also healthy. Both could survive long journeys, harsh conditions, and years in hiding. Hitler, in April 1945, was 56, and collapsing. He suffered from advanced Parkinson's disease, was dependent on a dangerous mix of medications, and his handwriting had degraded into barely readable fragments, a condition known as micrographia. His hands shook constantly. His gait had become a shuffle. He suffered from cardiovascular problems and severe exhaustion. The men who escaped were functional. Hitler was physically and mentally deteriorating. And finally, time. Eichmann escaped 5 years after the war ended. He had time to plan, to build contacts, to craft an identity, and to wait until the chaos faded. Mengele escaped under similar conditions. Hitler had days. Even if Hitler had slipped out of Berlin alive, his body would have betrayed him long before any enemy did. By the last week of April 1945, Soviet tanks were no longer approaching, they were already within a few city blocks. Escape corridors collapsed by the hour. Rail lines were severed. Airfields were under fire. What remained was not a plan, but chaos. The successful fugitives had something Hitler didn't: time and anonymity. Adolf Eichmann disappeared by becoming Ricardo Klement, a name that fit seamlessly into German-speaking communities abroad. Joseph Mengele reinvented himself as Helmut Greger. Ordinary names. Forgettable faces. They blended into expatriate neighborhoods in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil without drawing attention. Hitler could never do that. No alias could hide his face. No forged passport could erase his voice. His posture, his gestures, his stare, all instantly recognizable. Even radical plastic surgery wouldn't have saved him. Someone, somewhere, would have recognized the most famous man on earth. And history shows what would have followed. Eichmann lived free for 10 years before Mossad agents captured him in 1960. He stood trial and was executed. Mengele avoided justice, dying quietly in 1979. But Hitler? Had he reached South America, he wouldn't have lasted years. Not even months. He would have been found, and his fate would have mirrored Eichmann's: arrest, trial, execution. But there is an even more decisive barrier to escape: Hitler's body itself. By April 1945, Hitler was suffering from advanced Parkinson's disease, likely present since the early 1930s. Newsreels from the final year show unmistakable tremors in his left hand. His walk had slowed into a shuffle. His handwriting had collapsed into tight, cramped strokes, a classic symptom known as micrographia. His physician, Dr. Theodore Morel, was administering an astonishing 28 different medications daily. Amphetamines to keep him awake. Anticholinergics to suppress tremors. MAO inhibitors for depression. Hitler wasn't functioning, he was being chemically propped up. Neurologist Abraham Lieberman, who later studied Hitler's medical records, identified severe diurnal fluctuations. Some hours, Hitler appeared coherent. Other hours, he was barely capable of holding a conversation. By 1945, he could not function at all without his drug regimen. Then came the most revealing detail. 1 week before his death, Hitler dismissed Dr. Morel, declaring he no longer needed medical treatment. After years of total dependence, he simply stopped. He understood exactly what that meant. Now imagine an escape. A journey to Argentina by ship or submarine took weeks, cramped, airless, claustrophobic. No access to his medications. No personal doctor. Constant stress. Even under ideal conditions, Hitler would not have survived 3 days at sea, let alone 3 weeks. And then there's the logistics. The ratlines were not emergency exits. They were slow, deliberate post-war networks. They required months, often years, of preparation. Church contacts. Reliable forged documents. Careful movement through Allied checkpoints. Eichmann didn't flee in 1945. He waited until 1950, when chaos had settled and systems were in place. Mengele followed the same pattern. Hitler had days. Berlin was collapsing street by street. Soviet artillery was tightening the noose. Every possible exit was either under fire or already closed. The kind of patient, invisible escape that others achieved later was simply impossible in April 1945. Some still claim Hitler escaped by submarine to Argentina. It's true, a handful of German U-boats did reach South America after the war. The route existed. But the idea that Hitler was aboard one of them collapses under scrutiny. It begins with Hannah Reich. After flying out of Berlin on the night of April 28, she later told an American journalist that she had seen another pilot standing beside a Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft, seemingly waiting for someone. That single detail ignited decades of speculation. But there's a problem. During her official U.S. interrogation in October 1945, Reich stated clearly that no aircraft was present that Hitler could have used to escape. Her story only changed decades later, after conspiracy theories had already taken root. She wasn't revealing a secret. She was feeding a myth. We also know this: Soviet soldiers witnessed Reich's plane take off on April 28. Many believed Hitler was fleeing. 2 days later, on April 30, Soviet troops recovered Hitler's burned remains in the garden above the bunker. Dental records confirmed the identity. The remains were photographed. The case was closed. But let's entertain the hypothetical. Suppose Hitler reached Argentina. He would instantly become the most wanted man in history, hiding in a country under growing pressure from the United States and Britain. Yes, Perón's regime was sympathetic to former Nazis. Yes, Argentina sheltered thousands of war criminals. But Hitler was different. Harboring anonymous SS officers was one thing. Protecting the architect of World War II and the Holocaust was another entirely. Doing so would have shattered Argentina's diplomatic ties with the world. Sooner or later, likely sooner, his location would have been leaked. Quietly handed to Allied intelligence. Or discovered by Mossad, just as Eichmann was a decade later. The ratlines worked for men who could vanish. They could not work for Adolf Hitler. Every theoretical escape led to the same destination. Exposure, capture, trial, execution. And Hitler knew it. So what if Hitler had been taken alive? Imagine Allied troops reaching the bunker minutes earlier. Or intercepting him while fleeing Berlin. Or capturing him somewhere in Bavaria. However it happened, the result would have been immediate detention, most likely by American or British forces. Not the Soviets. Stalin would have ordered his execution on the spot. That alone would trigger a diplomatic crisis. The Soviet Union had lost more than 20 million people. Soviet troops had liberated Auschwitz and uncovered the machinery of extermination. Stalin would demand Hitler be handed over for a Soviet trial, or no trial at all. Washington and London would refuse. They needed Hitler alive for Nuremberg. Not just as a defendant, but as the symbol. The trials were never only about punishment. They were about creating a legal framework for prosecuting crimes against humanity. About writing an undeniable historical record. About legitimizing the post-war world order. Hitler in the dock would have been the center of gravity. But how would he behave? Unlike Göring, who treated the courtroom as a theater for ideology, Hitler would not play along. To defend himself would mean recognizing the court's authority. Accepting that the Führer answered to judges chosen by his enemies. His psychology made that impossible. He would either refuse to speak entirely, or erupt into incoherent rants about betrayal, destiny, and race until the judges removed him from the courtroom. Either way, the outcome was never in doubt. The verdict would be guilty. The sentence, death by hanging. The evidence was overwhelming. The Nazi state had documented its own crimes with ruthless precision. Survivor testimony sealed the case. Hitler would likely have been executed in late 1946, alongside the other condemned Nazi leaders. But here's the unexpected consequence. If Hitler had lived long enough to stand trial, even briefly, he might have altered the opening phase of the Cold War. For a time, he would remain a shared enemy. The Americans, British, and Soviets would be forced to cooperate in prosecuting him. That cooperation might delay the fracture of the wartime alliance, or accelerate it. Stalin could accuse the West of being too lenient toward fascism. The West might counter by highlighting Soviet terror, drawing uncomfortable parallels between Nazi genocide and Stalin's purges. Either way, Hitler's presence would dominate headlines and political calculations. His survival would keep global attention fixed on the past, rather than on the rapidly hardening divisions between East and West. His suicide on April 30, 1945 removed him abruptly from history. A trial would have extended his influence, and poisoned the post-war moment. But no matter which path we imagine, the destination never changes. The Alps were fiction. Switzerland would have traded him. Argentina was unreachable. Capture meant humiliation and death. Every road led to the same end. Which brings us to the final and most revealing question, not of logistics, but of psychology. Why did a man who condemned millions to die refuse even to try to escape? Because escape required accepting defeat. Hitler's identity was built on racial destiny. He believed Germans were chosen to rule. He believed Slavs, Jews, and others were inferior. When that worldview collapsed, when Soviet soldiers, the people he called Untermenschen, took Berlin, his universe shattered. He could not accept being captured by those he had tried to annihilate. He could not accept judgment by those he considered beneath him. He could not accept survival without supremacy. So he chose the only outcome he could still control. Death. Before the end, he handed Hannah Reich 2 cyanide capsules, one for her, one for von Grime, and ordered them to use them if captured. The message was clear: survival without power was worse than death. 3 days after she escaped Berlin, on May 3, 1945, Reich's father heard a rumor spreading through Germany, that all refugees would be returned to the Soviet zone. For Hitler, that rumor wasn't fear. It was confirmation. April 30, 1945 wasn't an escape denied. It was an ending chosen.